I will say the vast majority of Democrats are pro-law enforcement. And we believe that law enforcement...
He says they're Gestapo.
Let me finish.
He says they're Gestapo.
Scott,
do you agree?
Scott, let me finish.
Scott Jennings, CNN's go-to MAGA defender, completely unraveled on the latest episode of Abby Phillip's show while reacting to the tragic events in Minneapolis. We're going to break down several moments from this tense panel discussion, which featured Jennings alongside Ana Navarro. I'll also be sharing my own perspective as we go. Make sure to let me know what you think in the comments. And if you find this breakdown helpful, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's dive in.
Ana Navarro has joined us at the table. Ana, there were a lot of people who warned that, a massive increase in ICE presence on the ground would inevitably result in American citizens being the victims of some of these encounters.
Yeah, to me this day is very, very somber because I think there were so many indications that this was going to end up happening sooner or later. And it's a day where I think we need to be very sober. And I think, a few things. First, we live in America. We have a right to protest. We have a right to videotape what is happening and amplify the truth. But for the videos that were taken today, we wouldn't know the truth and we wouldn't be seeing it with our own eyes and able to judge it. Also, I think it's negligent that the ICE forces have been increased so quickly and that there's people without the proper training and the proper experience. I don't know if this agent who shot this woman today, I don't know if he's one of the new recruits that got offered $50,000 and maybe has less training and experience than ICE agents regularly do. And that might have been a contributing factor to how this ended up. Maybe if it had been an agent with more experience, the response would have been different. What I do know is that there's a 6-year-old boy who's now orphaned. His father died in 2023, and today his mother got shot to death. And I think it's a time of reflection in America. Protesters need to be peaceful. Protesters have every right to show up and demand accountability. But I also think our government has to be responsible in who they put out in the streets armed and the tone of what's happening with ICE. We've seen some agents really abuse power and almost relish what they are doing. We have seen pregnant women dragged through the streets. We have seen children left alone in cars. We have seen people shot. We have seen people chased like animals. Look, it's a very difficult situation, and we've got to reflect on how we do this so that it doesn't continue happening.
As you mentioned, it did seem to some people that we were headed in this direction because a couple of months ago, there was an incident involving another shooting with ICE agents. They shot into a vehicle and shot a woman. Then they charged her with trying to ram the law enforcement, but those charges were dismissed by a judge in part because of contradictory evidence that contradicted the ICE account of what happened in that incident. And I think all of this, to Anna's point, raises questions, Michael, for me, about this pact that we have between law enforcement and the citizenry, that under normal circumstances, when you get a badge and a gun, it's a huge amount of responsibility. And that responsibility also comes with, you show your face, you're accountable, you report to someone. And you also have, you have rules that you abide by. And that feels like the part that's missing here with ICE, that they've decided ICE agents don't need to show their faces. They don't need to abide by some of the basic principles that regular law enforcement officers do, even though they're engaging with the population at much greater degrees than they used to. Is it a moment to think about that and think about whether that is sustainable?
I'm sure I'm not opposed to having conversations about extended training. Look, if one wants to raise questions about shortening training, if you're going to have agents who don't typically act in law enforcement roles, I would not be opposed to that from my experience with law enforcement, broadly speaking. But even with well-trained officers, we have seen instances where officers have to make split decisions. And sometimes it's not nice. we shouldn't jump to conclusions by calling this guy a murderer. We don't know yet. We have no clue. And I know
One of the go-to talking points from the right has been that ICE agents were faced with split-second decisions. But in the footage circulating from Minneapolis, you see a man identifying himself as a doctor step up and ask to check the woman's pulse, and ICE agents physically won't let him through to provide aid. Witnesses also reported that an ambulance was delayed or blocked from reaching her for several minutes after she was shot. Those decisions to block help aren't made in the blink of an eye. Meanwhile, federal officials, including DHS leadership, have publicly characterized the driver as a domestic terrorist, a label that wasn't a sudden reaction in the moment, but a calculated political framing. And if you look at the opening of that Abby Phillips panel, Anna Navarro lays out, calmly and clearly, real concerns about how ICE is operating and why accountability matters. In contrast, Scott Jennings shifted almost immediately into a defense of law enforcement while accusing Democrats of being anti-police, even though what people on the ground and video evidence show is federal agents blocking aid from reaching someone who had just been shot. That isn't how local police in this country operate. Paramedics and doctors aren't barred from rendering assistance after someone is wounded. American first responders aren't supposed to stand between a doctor and a wounded civilian. That's not a split-second judgment. That's a choice with real consequences.
Oh, that's difficult to say. Someone has died. I acknowledge that. There's a child who's lost another parent. That doesn't make me comfortable or as a human being at all. But I do believe you have to empower law enforcement officials to do their jobs while assuring that you're also protecting the constitutional rights of citizens. And that's just the way I look at this.
But this looked to me like there was something very wrong because, I mean, you know, this ICE officer shot at least 3 times that we could hear on the video with other ICE officers very close to the driver, with people all around the car, with a moving car situation happening, which resulted into that car careening into another car and a tree and could have caused even more death and injuries. So I think we've got to acknowledge all of those things. I saw earlier today the former mayor of Miami-Dade, Carlos Jimenez, who is now a Republican from South Florida, a congressman from South Florida, huge Trump supporter. But when he was mayor of Miami-Dade, and he's also been a fireman for over 20 years. When he was mayor of Miami-Dade, he was the chief executive of the police department. And Jake asked him how he felt about this. And he said, I'm not ready to defend the ICE officer. I have serious questions. And I think we need to take off our partisan hats and we need to look at this with, be very cold-headed, because what we need to work on is make sure to avoid these kind of situations in the future.
Chris Murphy said Democrats cannot vote for a DHS budget that does not restrain the growing lawlessness of this agency. And increasingly, I'm hearing and seeing a lot of Democrats basically saying, back when defund ICE was a position that some liberals were taking and moderates were saying, well, that's gone too far. Now more and more so-called moderates are saying this agency is out of control. When we retake power, we've got to do something about it. Do you think that's the right move?
I think any agency that has this much money behind them needs to have accountability, and it doesn't have that. And I think if there's any question to what Shermichael's making and what Anna is saying, this idea of we don't really know what happened, we don't know what the officer was thinking in this moment, it might come down to training, it might not come down to training, it looks like this, it looks like that. At the end of the day, she was pulled out of the car and she was not dead yet. And a doctor was on the scene and tried to help her. And the ICE officer said, get away from her or we'll shoot you. So they shot a woman and then threatened to shoot a man who was trying to help the woman. So if you're telling me that this was just a split-second decision, she might have been saved. But her wife had to watch her bleed out on the ground while a doctor stood by with an ICE officer with a gun in his face. So I don't know what we're talking here.
In that aftermath.
Well, they've spoken to the doctor.
Right. No, yeah. And I think my point is that what transpired after she was shot, did they render aid? Did they allow aid to be rendered to her? Again, this is all part of the picture that Americans are seeing, and they're asking, what's going on here?
Well, they're all fair questions and should all be part of a legitimate investigation. I think that's what the American people would expect. I mean, a lot of people witnessed this. There have been a lot of witnesses on television today. We played some. I saw another interview with another witness who said that this lady in the van was the leader of a convoy that was attempting to impede and obstruct the road where legitimate law enforcement operations were taking place. I would also like to know if that is true, because that's what an eyewitness has said. If that is true, I think one of the questions we have to ask is, why are people believing that it is okay to create vehicle convoys for the purpose of impeding federal law enforcement? My suspicion is it's because they've been told by politicians that it is their responsibility to do so. It is, in fact, a felony to obstruct federal law enforcement activities. If you don't like the immigration laws, that's a legitimate position, but you don't change laws by creating convoys to obstruct law enforcement officers. You call the politicians and ask them to change the laws. Political vigilantism is getting people killed. This lady should not be dead. I hate it that she is dead, because this poor kid, as Anna said, is an orphan. I don't love in any way, shape, or form that someone is dead, but we have to ask ourselves hard questions about why people are putting themselves in these positions. And we've seen it all over the country.
Because they're
Abby.
Americans and they can't stand what they are seeing. I don't think it's.
Does that mean you can impede a law enforcement officer?
No, but that wasn't the case on January
problem is
6th
there's
either.
no
And they were
oversight.
pardoned. And just this week, they were marching down the street to the Capitol again. Why are you shaking your head?
Because
you
this cannot be your go-to.
But no, I'm not saying that.
On January 6th,
I am pro law enforcement.
Democrats said we're pro law enforcement. Today they say they're Gestapo. Which is it? Which is it?
No, I will say the vast majority of Democrats are.
What we're talking about here isn't your typical police department. This was an ICE operation, and that matters. In Minneapolis, federal immigration agents were out on a mission when a 37-year-old woman, Renee Nicole Good, ended up being shot and killed by an ICE officer. Good was a U.S. citizen. She wasn't someone who was wanted or charged with a crime, and local officials say there was no indication she was the subject of an investigation. So when Scott Jennings says, "Hey, they were just doing their job and acting lawfully," ask yourself this. If we haven't been given a full, transparent account of what happened on that street, and city leaders like Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey are publicly disputing the federal narrative, how can he jump to that defense? This woman wasn't an illegal immigrant, and she wasn't trying to attack officers with a weapon. She was a citizen who, according to local reporting, was in her car when the encounter unfolded, and then an ICE agent fired the shots that killed her. That's very different from arguments about the Capitol Police responding to an insurrection. Those were law enforcement officers in uniform trying to stop an actual riot. Here, you have federal agents shooting and killing a civilian whose actual role in the situation is still being clarified through investigation and local dispute. That's the context Scott Jennings is glossing over, and it's why a lot of people see his comments as disingenuous.
Are pro law enforcement, and we believe that
Is
law
Tim Walz?
enforcement.
He says they're Gestapo.
Let me finish.
He says they're Gestapo.
Scott,
Do you agree?
Scott,
you
let
agree?
me finish. I do not agree. Let me
Good.
finish. Many Democrats, and the vast majority of them, are pro law enforcement. They believe that law enforcement should actually get the training that they deserve and they need. Hold on, I'm not done. Hold on.
You
Yes,
don't know
I
about
know.
this guy's
Let
training.
me tell you.
Stop
in
implying that he's not trained.
In Minnesota,
He was dragged by a car last
let me tell
summer.
you, in Minnesota, blocks from where this woman was killed was the George Floyd shooting. What happened at the time is the Justice Department entered a consent decree with the Minneapolis Police Department wanting to provide those law enforcement officers training so something like that would never happen again. And Donald Trump's administration completely dismissed that matter. And so now Minneapolis law enforcement officials are not getting the training that they need. Democratic Party is pro-law enforcement. They were pro-law enforcement on January 6th. They didn't issue those
They
pardons.
call them
They're
the Gestapo, Sochi.
They're pro-law
They call them
enforcement now,
murderers.
and
They
it
call
is-
them Nazis.
But why is it one rule for ICE, and why is it another rule for the Capitol Police or the Republican Party? Can you answer that question?
I have the same rule for all law enforcement. I think we should
But the
respect all law
administration
enforcement.
has two
you
rules.
all have
One-
select
I-
one
I
day a
guess
year.
one rule
One day
for
a year you
January
like the
6th
cops.
officers.
Well, look,
the other 364 days
listen,
you call them the Gestapo.
listen,
That's the
that's not-
Democratic
that
position.
is not the
I want to pause here for a second because Scott Jennings' claim that Democrats only support law enforcement one day a year is just absurd. Who are these Democrats who are supposedly anti-law enforcement? People aren't against policing. They're against police brutality. They're against officers shooting unarmed people. And they're against situations like this where ICE shoots a woman who appeared to be turning her car around and then blocks medical aid. I don't know anyone who opposes law enforcement stopping real crimes. What people oppose is abuse of power. That's why Scott Jennings' framing here is completely disingenuous. Now let's go back to Ana Navarro. Her comments were calm, measured, and frankly, very reasonable. She even referenced a MAGA supporter on the panel who admitted he wasn't ready to defend ICE yet, because we don't have all the facts. That's a rational position. But Scott Jennings isn't interested in waiting for facts. He's going to defend ICE and this administration no matter what. We saw that immediately when Kristi Noem came out and labeled this woman a terrorist without first saying, "This was tragic. We need to investigate what happened and gather all the facts." That's not how this administration operates. The Trump administration has never been about facts or truth-telling, and figures like Scott Jennings exist to run interference, to act as a propaganda arm for MAGA, and to excuse whatever this administration does. So I want to ask you, where do you land on this? Are you siding with Scott Jennings, that Democrats hate the police and oppose law enforcement? Because I don't buy that for a second. Or are you siding with Ana Navarro and others on Abby Phillip's show who are simply calling for oversight and accountability with ICE? Because we cannot have masked federal agents shooting people in our streets with no transparency and no consequences. Other law enforcement officers don't hide their faces. They don't block doctors and paramedics from helping someone who's been injured. Accountability matters. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I appreciate you bearing with me. My voice isn't quite where it normally is today, but thank you for listening and watching.